everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kirsty and I create art videos here on YouTube. So I create lots of tutorials and also speed drawing videos. I mainly work with colour pencil, but today I'm going to be doing a video on 10 easy techniques for watercolours, and this is really good for anyone that's beginning using watercolour. So for this tutorial I'm going to be using the Winsor & Newton professional watercolours, and I'm just using some watercolour paper. So the first technique that I'm going to be showing you guys is wet into wet. So this is where you apply the water first and then go over the top with the paint. And this method is really good if you want no harsh edges when you do your watercolours, because everything blends really seamlessly. So it's really good if you want to do backgrounds where there's really soft landscapes and stuff like that, or if you want to do skin and you need the skin tones to blend into each other really seamlessly and smooth. And the only thing that is a bit difficult with this technique is that you have a bit less control. Because you've applied the water first, it means when you put the paint over the top of the water, it tends to want to move around a bit more than if you were to put it on dry paper. So this will take a bit of practice, so experiment with the different amounts of water that you want to put onto the paper first, because the more water you put on, the less control you'll have over the paint. So once you've applied the paint on top of the water, you can apply more paint. So for example, I'm drawing in some trees, and when this dries, all the colours will blend into each other so that you won't get any harsh lines and you won't be able to see where each colour starts and stops. So I love doing this for landscapes, so I like to apply the base colour and then add the trees that are going to be in the distance whilst it's wet, and when that dries I can then go over with the watercolour onto the dry medium to add in some details, and it gives your work a lot of dimension if you have areas which are a bit more blurry and then areas where there's more detail and more crisp lines over the top. So the second technique that I'm going to be showing you is using a water pen, and this is where you apply the paint first onto the dry paper and then you go in with the water pen, and I'm using the pen towel water pen, and you use this to create gradients, and it's really good at creating smooth gradients. So you apply the paint first and then you use that water pen which has water in the tube, and as you go down more water will come off onto the paint, which means that you can get dark tones to really light tones. So again, I like using this for skin. So moving on to the third technique, and this is just where I'm applying the wet paint onto dry paper. And this technique is really good if you want to get fine details and also if you want to have more control over the paint. But it will give you some harsher lines, which might be something that you don't want. So next is the fourth technique, and this is where I like to use a paper towel or a tissue or any bit of cloth really, and it's really nice when the paint is wet because you can lift off some of the paint to create some nice soft highlights. So for example, I like to use this when I'm doing clouds, or you can use it with a more defined edge to create highlighted details. But this only works when the paint is wet. The wetter it is, the more paint you can remove, and if you let it dry a bit you can get some softer highlights. So the fifth technique is something that I actually learned quite recently, and this is where you apply the paint first just like normal, and then when it's nearly dry but still a bit wet, that's where it works the best, you apply the salt, and as it's drying it creates a really cool pattern. So I'm showing you a few examples of this to show you the different kind of effects you can get with the salt. So the first technique that I did, it was a lot less visible, it was more of a softer effect and a bit more subtle. And that's because the paint was a bit wetter, so it didn't work as harshly as it could have. With the second one, I let it dry a bit more, so it's a bit more drier before I applied the salt, and this gives a much more visible effect. And this is really good if you want to create a snowy sky or just a different kind of technique within your background really, and it adds a bit more interest into your work. Also, once you've let the paint dry, then make sure that you rub off the salt because you don't want the salt staying on your artwork. So just gently rub it off and make sure it's all off before you continue painting on that area. So moving on to the sixth technique, you'll see me use this a lot in my watercolour work. So this is masking fluid, and I have a lot of you ask me about masking fluid on a daily basis. So what I like to do when I'm doing my watercolour paintings is kind of section off my subjects by using the masking fluid, so that when I'm doing my watercolour background, none of the paint from the background gets onto the main subject. So masking fluid is just something that you apply first before you do your watercolour painting, and you can apply this with a paintbrush, but bear in mind that it will really clog up your paintbrush, so don't use your favourite paintbrush. And I'm using the Daler and Rowney masking fluid, but just look for any masking fluid which says that it's used for watercolours. So you apply the masking fluid first, let it dry, and then you can go over with the paint, and once the paint is dry you can peel off that masking fluid and you'll see that none of the paint has gone on to where I applied the masking fluid. So I like to create different effects with the masking fluid, so you can obviously just block off a subject, or I like to splatter a bit on and it creates these little dots. Next is my 7th technique, and this again is something that I learnt fairly recently, and this is where you can use cling film once you've applied your watercolour paint, and you can use the cling film to create stems on plants and stuff like that, because when you apply the cling film it sticks in certain areas and you can use your fingers to manipulate which composition you want. So I'm just tugging it around a bit to get the composition that I would like, and then once you've let the paint dry you can peel off the cling film and it gives a really nice effect because it lightens where the cling film did not stick to the paper. And here's just another example of me doing this cling film effect on a larger scale. So yeah, I think this technique is really useful if you want to do plants or flowers, trees or anything like that, and it adds a lot more interest and a bit more depth, and it's a really nice way of getting the highlights without having to mask anything off and do it individually and paint stuff on. So my 8th technique is something that I do quite a bit as well, and this is where I like to create splatter effects. So you can use straws to blow the paint around and this gives a nice splatter effect, or you can tap the paintbrush and it deposits dots of the paint onto it, or you can fling the paintbrush, and flinging the paintbrush gives a splatter effect and some dots. So experiment with this before you go into your actual piece and try it. So experiment on scrap pieces of paper. It doesn't have to be anything special if you're just experimenting with it, but just get a feel for how much paint gets deposited onto the paper when you use your hands and flick the paint on and stuff like that. So my 9th technique is using gouache. So I really like to use gouache over the top of the watercolours to add in stronger highlights or to add in soft highlights. So I use the gouache with a paintbrush and I just pull it onto the paint and you can get a really soft white highlight, and if the paint is still wet, if you tap on the gouache and stuff like that, it just blends into the water and the paint so it's not as harsh. But if you want a harsh highlight then you can let the paint dry and then apply it on top. But if you do apply it onto wet paint, then you will get a softer finish because it will bleed slightly into the paint and water next to it. And finally, my 10th technique is using the wet and weft method to get a more splotchy effect. So for this I'm using 2 colours, I'm using pink and blue, and I'm just applying water first, and I use a bit more water than I did in my first method so that the paint really can move around on top of the water. So I apply a bit more water than before, and then I just touch the paintbrush with the paint on top of it onto the water, and the colour just spreads itself and really flows with the water. And you can just let the paint do its magic and just tap in the different colours where you want them onto the paint, but you don't really have to blend anything because there's quite a lot of water. It will just blend itself and everything will look really pretty. Anyway guys, here is an overview of all of the 10 techniques that I've done today. As I said, these are really easy for beginners, and using these techniques can add a lot of interest to your watercolour work and can really help you out speeding up the process. So for example, the masking fluid really speeds up the process because you don't have to worry about getting any of the paint from the background onto the subject that you're masking off, so you can really just go loose and not worry about messing up areas next to it. Anyway guys, I really hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did and you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe because I have lots more tutorials for both watercolours and colour pencils coming up on my channel, and I have them every single week. Also, if you like this video, then I really would appreciate it if you'd like and give this video a share, as it would really help my channel grow and also help the video grow. Also, I'd love to hear if any of you guys do try out these techniques, or if you've got any other techniques of your own that you'd like to share. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. As always, I'll leave the links to my social media sites and my online store in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!